They didn't run to jungles, they hid next to you. In May 1945, as the guns finally fell silent, Germany lay in ruins. Cities were reduced to rubble, millions were displaced, and Allied soldiers marched across a defeated Reich. Amid the chaos, something unsettling was happening. The men who had once commanded death camps, the very architects of industrialized murder, did not always vanish into far-off jungles or remote hideouts. Many of them melted quietly into the wreckage of ordinary German life. Some took on new names and invented new trades. Rudolf Höss, once commandant of Auschwitz and responsible for the murder of over 1 million people, reappeared not as a war criminal, but as a humble farmhand. Under the alias Franz Lang, he lived in a small rural community, tending chickens and fields, while his neighbors remained unaware of the role he had played in history's darkest chapter. He was not alone. Others found refuge in towns where nobody asked questions, where a new set of clothes and a forged document were enough to erase the past. They worked as mechanics, shop clerks, or laborers, blending into the very communities they had once condemned as inferior. The war was over, but the shadows of its architects lingered. Men who had once orchestrated genocide now sat quietly at dinner tables, walked through markets, and nodded politely to strangers. The architects of mass murder became invisible neighbors. While the war criminals tried to disappear, others were determined to find them. Allied investigators, newly formed war crimes units, and survivors who refused to be silenced launched what became the largest manhunt in modern history. Their task was immense. Europe was in ruins, borders had collapsed, and millions of displaced people were moving across the continent. Yet, within that chaos, the hunters set to work. They combed through piles of Nazi administrative records. The Reich had been a bureaucracy of murder, and bureaucracies keep meticulous files. Investigators photographed crime scenes before nature could reclaim them. Gas chambers, crematoria, execution walls. Every brick, every scratch was documented. Survivors were interviewed, their testimonies recorded in harrowing detail. Some former SS officers, eager to save themselves, betrayed their colleagues by offering names, addresses, and hiding places. But the pursuit was never easy. The fugitives were resourceful, aided by networks of sympathizers and skilled at vanishing into the ruins. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse. Investigators faced threats, intimidation, and even assassination attempts as they closed in on their targets. Despite exhaustion and danger, they pressed on. Many worked 18-hour days, chasing leads across borders, piecing together fragments of evidence. Each delay risked the truth slipping away as documents decayed, memories faded, and witnesses grew silent. Justice was racing against time before memory and evidence disappeared forever. One by one, the faceless men behind the Holocaust were dragged back into the light. Their captures shocked the world, not only for the crimes they revealed, but for the ordinariness of the men themselves. Joseph Kramer was known as the Beast of Belsen. At Bergen-Belsen, thousands died under his command from starvation, neglect, and deliberate cruelty. When British troops liberated the camp in April 1945, Kramer tried to present himself as an officer negotiating surrender. Instead, he was marched through the camp in shackles, forced to confront the skeletal corpses his leadership had produced. His trial later that year was among the first devoted solely to concentration camp crimes. Witnesses described his cold indifference, and on December 13, 1945, Joseph Kramer was sentenced to death by hanging. Amon Göth, the brutal commandant of the Kraków camp, ruled with sadistic pleasure. Survivors recalled how he shot prisoners from his balcony for sport. At war's end, he was arrested by U.S. troops and handed over to Polish authorities. The once arrogant SS officer now appeared gaunt, sickly, and broken. His trial in 1946 revealed the depth of his atrocities. He was convicted and hanged, a hollow figure compared to the feared tyrant he had once been. Then there was Rudolf Höss, perhaps the most infamous of them all, the architect of Auschwitz. He had vanished into rural life under the name Franz Lang, working as a farmhand. His disguise might have lasted longer, but betrayal came from within his own household. Under interrogation, his wife Hedwig finally admitted his whereabouts. When investigators confronted him, Höss at first denied everything, until a wedding ring engraved with his real initials exposed the lie. Extradited to Poland, he was ordered to write his memoirs. What he produced was chilling, a matter-of-fact description of genocide, written with the tone of a man describing factory logistics. At his trial in Warsaw, his own words sealed his fate. On April 16, 1947, Rudolf Höss was hanged at Auschwitz, the very place he had turned into a machine of death. Each capture was both justice served and a glimpse into the banality of evil. Not all Nazi commanders were captured by the Allies. Some never faced outside justice because the regime itself had already dealt with them. In the twisted logic of the SS, betrayal of bureaucratic rules often mattered more than crimes against humanity. Take the case of Theodor Eicke. He was the architect of the entire concentration camp system, designing the regulations, the punishments, and the psychological training that turned ordinary guards into killers. His methods became the blueprint for Auschwitz, Dachau, and dozens of other camps. Yet Eicke never stood trial. In 1943, he was killed in combat on the Eastern Front. Instead of condemnation, he was celebrated as a hero of the Reich. One of the men most responsible for mechanized mass murder escaped justice simply by dying a soldier's death. Then there was Karl and Ilse Koch, the infamous couple who ruled Buchenwald. Karl, the camp commandant, embezzled from the Reich, skimming valuables stolen from murdered prisoners. His wife Ilse indulged in grotesque cruelty, collecting souvenirs crafted from the skin of inmates. Their crimes shocked even fellow Nazis, but here was the irony. The Gestapo did not move against them for the suffering they caused. They acted because Karl Koch's corruption threatened the SS itself. To the regime, stealing from the Reich was a greater betrayal than murder. Karl was executed by his own comrades in 1945. Ilse, acquitted at first under Nazi law, was later arrested by the Allies and eventually convicted in a post-war trial. These stories revealed a system devouring itself, a regime that protected mass murder but crushed anyone who violated its internal codes of loyalty and profit. The Nazi system punished betrayal of rules more harshly than crimes against humanity. By the 1970s, most believed the great Nazi manhunt had ended. The war was 3 decades past, and many perpetrators had blended so deeply into ordinary life that their crimes seemed destined to fade into obscurity. But justice, though delayed, was not forgotten. One of the most controversial cases was John Demjanjuk. For years, he lived a quiet life in Cleveland, Ohio, working in a factory and raising a family. Then, Holocaust survivors identified him as Ivan the Terrible, a sadistic guard from Treblinka. His extradition to Israel in the 1980s triggered a trial that gripped the world. Eyewitnesses described a man who had operated gas chambers with chilling brutality, but later evidence from Soviet archives cast doubt on his identity, leading to his acquittal. Decades later, in 2009, German prosecutors charged him again, this time as a guard at Sobibor, complicit in the murder of 28,000 Jews. Demjanjuk was by then an old man, frail and in his 80s, yet the trial pressed on. His conviction in 2011 symbolized something profound, that age did not erase guilt, and that even the twilight years could not shield one from justice. He was not alone. Across Europe, elderly defendants shuffled into courtrooms. Oskar Gröning, once the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, stood trial in 2015 at the age of 94. His job had been to count money taken from prisoners and keep the machinery of extermination running. Survivors, now in their 90s themselves, testified against him, their trembling voices carrying the weight of memory. These trials faced enormous obstacles. Evidence had decayed, witnesses had died, and critics asked whether justice served against such aged men could truly matter. But for survivors, each case affirmed a vital principle, that the world had not forgotten, and that complicity in mass murder could never be excused by time. Even decades later, justice remained a sacred obligation. The story of Nazi camp commanders does not end with trials, verdicts, or executions. Its deeper meaning lies in what it reveals about how societies descend into atrocity. Genocide does not erupt overnight. It begins with small compromises, with words that divide, laws that exclude, and silences that allow cruelty to grow unchecked. Step by step, discrimination hardens into persecution, and persecution, left unchallenged, evolves into mass murder. What made these crimes possible was not only the ambition of camp commandants, but the complicity of ordinary people. Neighbors who turned away, bureaucrats who stamped papers, soldiers who obeyed without question. Silence, cooperation, or passive acceptance all played a role in turning ideology into reality. Justice, then, is not only about punishment. It is also about remembrance. Every trial, every testimony, every document preserved is a warning to future generations that evil can return in familiar forms. It reminds us that democracy, law, and morality are fragile and must be defended actively, not assumed. The pursuit of justice against Nazi war criminals stretched across decades, across continents, and across lifetimes. It was never perfect, often delayed, and sometimes incomplete, but it carried a message far greater than the fate of any individual defendant, that the world would not forget, and that crimes against humanity would not be allowed to vanish into silence. Justice has no expiration date, and neither does responsibility.